Swinsky, who's from the Department of Philosophy.
Well, Alan Gray.
Oh, yes. Used to be from the Department of Philosophy.
Well, the
now,
center is part of philosophy.
Okay.
But it's kind of semi-independent. Yeah.
Okay, Alan Gray's Center for
Leadership.
Leadership Ethics. And his center's been running a course called Existential Conversations for the last
3 years. 2 years piloting. This year is a short course. Next year, if everything goes according to plan, it's going to be
are you going to say something about the short course, or that particular course being a kind of forerunner to what could be?
a common yes. I want to talk about the strategic and about the content and about the strategies to make it do the work that we want it to do.
So would you sit here, or would you want to?
Should we do a circle?
Yeah, it's easier to see each other.
Intellectuals alone, which means conversations about life and things. So there's a few. So a little bit about the history. The reason the center has Alan Gray's name on it is it has to do with the fact that Salim, there was money that was basically not being spent in one section of the university, and Salim Barat decided that that money should be spent. So he gave me the lion's share. He decided that it should be connected to the philosophy department and connected to leadership, and it should be something that the philosophy department, someone in the philosophy department can take on. And he contacted Sam Weiss and me, and Samantha Weiss, and Samantha Weiss wasn't that keen on these sorts of adventures, and I decided to take on. Because I think I'm a bit of a maverick, and I like doing crazy things, and one of the things that I value most about the sort of job that I do is creativity, and I find that I don't get enough of it at universities. I think universities tend more than I would like to be gatekeepers of traditions, of knowledge, of disciplines, and more than people who are genuinely committed to taking the knowledge project to a different level. I just don't see enough of it in my experience. I want more of it. So I thought, well, I'm not a big fan of the idea of leadership. I think it's we've done a survey of the leadership literature that it was requested by Salim that we do this, and I grudgingly accepted in the end after I was basically pushed, because I know the literature is absolutely tosh. It's crap. It's just, and that was most of it is just crap. It's stuff. You know, I mean, I'm a big fan of interdisciplinarity. I think we need to have that, but this is kind of an excuse for people who have very few academic credentials to start talking about whatever they want to talk about. What's good about the idea of leadership, though, is that it's an umbrella concept that can be used for anything, right? So the student movement is calling, they call each other leaders, right? So, and in the corporate world, there's a lot of talk. It's used in all sorts of spaces, and it's an incredibly open-ended, vague term, which means that I can do, and we can do at the center, can do a lot of things with it, which is what we've done. So there was, and I had to find out. I had to think. Initially, it was just me, and I had to think what direction is the center going to take. One of the things I really thank Alan Gray for. We had to ask him permission, and I had to sell him the idea. But once that happened, he's a completely hands-off funder, except for the fact that he requested his name on the center, which is fine. I don't mind supporting someone's legacy project, especially given that he's been very generous and he's helping us do really creative work. He's hands-off. That's a pretty impressive thing. Quite rare for funders to do. There's a few issues that I was not satisfied with in the current state of universities globally, not just in South Africa. We talk a lot about transformation in South Africa. I think there's a bigger issue about transformation in the tertiary sector generally. We take it for granted that universities are kind of constructs of nature, that they've kind of always been there and always been that. shape. And in fact, universities are a pretty new invention. And one should not take for granted that universities need to have, or whatever it is that might happen in the future, need to have the shape that universities currently have. And part of the story that I have to say about the evolution of my ideas was the assessor's course that helped me start to think about it. Before then, I think I was very much focused on research, and I had this very standard views about what my role as an academic is, and first and foremost a researcher, and teaching is what we have to do to sustain the university, that our primary goal should be research, our assessment, our promotions, and so on and so forth tend to be global, not just here. Less here, actually, in other places, tend to be focused on research outputs, not on your teaching credentials. Okay, so what are the disappointments that kind of inform the concern with existential conversation? The first one is a disappointment with the standard thing that everyone's talking about, is transformation happening quickly enough. What are we going to do? What shape should it take? How should we understand it? Secondly, one of the key problems I find in universities, in addition to what people call this very broad notion that I think needs a series of packing colonial institutions, but we still need to unpack that. It needs to be unpacked much more than we have. Is something more basic that has to do with universities globally, which is not helping, right? Change those things that we think we want to change when we talk about our universities being colonial institutions, which is that universities are the caretakers of the status quo globally. They tend to be places where, increasingly tend to be places where we. Hello.
Been searching.
Come in.
Please go in. Jen, have you been searching for us?
Yes.
Grab a chair and join the circle.
So they tend to
You
be.
don't have to know.
The university is a kind of perpetuator of the status quo. It's a place where you come to get a degree to either perpetuate the family wealth in a new job or climb the social ladder. But that's universities too strongly are focused on that, and I think that's damaging to the academic project. I think university should be about. And here I'm very conservative. I go back to the beginnings of the university, before university even existed in ancient Greece, where universities were places of wisdom, places where wisdom is supposed to be cultivated, where the approach to education was a whole person education. It's all about being a certain sort of human being. And I think we need to, although we shouldn't talk negatively about professions, those are really important, and obviously we need people with skills. We also need human beings in the richest sense of the term. So how are we going to cultivate this sort of, and I don't think universities, the hidden curriculum of universities is not exactly cultivating kind of rich humanity.
I'm puzzled by something. So there are a lot of kind of trendy phrases one hears, and one of them is, university is a caretaker of the status quo. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. So
let me clarify. Can I just talk first, and then we can go into it, because if you don't mind.
Yeah. So Pedro's going to talk for about 20 minutes.
Okay, so do that,
Okay.
and then just
And
keep
then
your
we'll talk.
question, and I think we need to unpack things, but by caretakers of the status quo, just quickly, I just mean we help. So let me just qualify this. So kids who come from schools generally, and I've spoken to many students, right, coming into this is about career, about getting a career that will get me money. Money is what I want to get, right? So when I talk about caretakers of status quo, it's about money, right? So we want to kind of. I think we need to break that cycle, right? The university needs to do something active there, not just. And so the existential conversations or intentos of belonging are meant to kind of help address that. And so another source, another concern is a misunderstanding of what it means to know. Like, I think one of the things that is implicit in academic institutions is what I think is a misunderstanding of what knowledge is. So about the epistemic, a misunderstanding about the epistemic. And that insight comes initially from people like Pico and Fanon, actually. So for them, it was very clear that, and if you go back, it goes back to insights some of the most important and richest insights from Marx and from psychoanalysis as well. So so the basic idea is that the way we see the world and the way we understand things is a function of the space in which we are located, right? So if you're in a colonial space and we need to unpack that and it's understood whatnot, that's going to tend to form certain mindsets. And those mindsets have an impact on the way that we understand our specific careers, our specific professions, whatever, our specific courses of choice. And so we need to address that sort of issue. So there's a kind of underlying substratum that we don't address. Let's call it someone like Hans-Georg Gadamer, famous German philosopher, would call it prejudice. We have a bunch of prejudices, we have a bunch which in a way gives us the outlook on the world. Prejudice is not always necessarily wrong and bad, but it can be. So we have a basic set of vision of the world, which is not challenged really. And on top of that, we have the professions that's where we work at the Contemporary University. And I think we need to challenge that. We need to challenge the prejudices. We need to kind of invite students to see what's underneath the bonnet, so to speak. What is so to speak happening what is taken for granted, right? And so we've developed, and Biko and Fanon have helped me think about this thing, as I said. But I'm not a glorifier of anyone. I find it quite irritating when people glorify Fanon or Biko or anyone else for that matter, or Makiba or.
So who's the second name? I just couldn't hear the name.
Biko and Fanon.
Fanon.
Franz Fanon.
F-A-N-O-N.
Okay, I'll
Franz
translate
Fanon.
later.
But these are people that have invited us to think about things deeply and importantly, and we need to move on. We need to take those thoughts somewhere different, we need to continue the tradition that they set in motion, as opposed to just using these texts as Bibles. So one of the places that, as if they were Bibles, was sacred texts of sort that cannot be violated or questioned. Something that concerns me in the contemporary South African University. And so I started reading a lot about social psychology, and I started seeing a lot of parallels. So the basic insight that I like from Fanon that I want to focus on today, we can focus on other things, and Biko, is this deep insight about, and interestingly, they were both medical doctors, right? Is the relationship between the way we see the world, the way we understand things, and the world we live in. So the structural conditions people talk about. But I think there's more than just political structural conditions. There's other stuff as well, but that's very important. Social psychology talks about that, and there's an incredible, huge growth area in that field. Enormous. It's extremely interesting work. And so another disillusionment is with my own field, philosophy, and taking it in a different sort of. I think it needs to go in a different sort of direction. South Africa has invited me to think about philosophy in my field in a very different and rich way, I think, and I hope. And I'm struggling, but I'm working on it. I'm working to think about how to make philosophy, let's call it relevant. Even though I don't like that word that much, unless it's unpacked here every time. On question time, we can come back to that. But so how do we make philosophy speak to our reality, but something also more general, which is embodied in its findings in a really great recent experiment in which moral philosophers, so philosophers that are concerned about what's good and what's bad and how people ought to behave. There was a test done in the US with thousands of moral philosophers. It's a complicated test, I've forgotten the details, but I can guide you in the right direction. But basically they found that moral philosophers are no more ethical human beings than anyone else. That means a lot, though, to me. That's a real important insight, which actually goes back to the origins of philosophy and the old problem of appraisal, of weakness of will, which is basically the ultimate problem of there's a big disjunct between the way we understand things intellectually and our acting in the world, right? Hypocrisy is very common in human beings, and it's something that is not always avoidable unless we do a lot of work on the self. So this finding was great. It was just confirmed my intuitions that, qua ethical philosopher, I'm not any better person, any more ethical than even though I spend most of my waking life thinking about these things. It doesn't make me any more ethical. And that's, to me, is a sign of a misunderstanding of the intellectual project as purely intellectual. right, so what is it that we can do to change people's ways of being and perceiving those prejudices, right? The way in which the total orientations, how can we engage in a genuinely transformative curriculum that will change the way that people act, so that then when they finish the university, they don't just end up saying, wow, I learned how to become a good accountant, I learned how to become a good sociologist or a good philosopher, and I can now go into the market and make a killing. No, I want students who come from to come out of Rhodes and say, I'm no longer the same person who was when I started. I'm a better person, I'm a more mature person, I'm a more enlightened person. I'm a person that can go and really make changes in different spheres of life where I might end up having been in contact with. And so we developed this program based on some of the people that I've mentioned here and other people as well. And so the idea is, and I also have this problem with applied ethics. So in applied ethics courses, this is courses in which philosophers typically go and they teach ethics to other people outside of philosophy. Accounting ethics is a classical case. And I started accounting ethics and I thought it was completely flawed, and we were doing nothing, right? The standard way of teaching accounting ethics is not going to change anything. Accountants are going to cook the book. They don't cook the book because they don't know that they're doing something that's wrong, right? So if I go stand there and say cooking the book is wrong, I'm not being unique. I'm just saying, I'm stating the obvious. But I can even go a little bit more complicated and say a little bit more fancy things, but actually, in the end of the day, it ends up being as stupid as that. So how do we change people's genuine orientation towards the world, so that in fact they act differently from the way that they would act? Well, and so one of the interesting insights from social psychology in particular, and also in a way going back to the initial source of inspiration in people of Fanon, is this idea that to be ethical is just to be ethical is pretty much just to be able to see the world as it is, right? Not to be alienated from the world, not to be deceived. And this is corroborated by a lot of readings that I've done about the nature of evil and how people do, why people do the sort of things that they do, from Jean de Kock to the Nazi perpetrators, Rwanda massacre. You name your evil person. What's interesting about evil people is that whatever it is that evil people never do things knowing that they're evil. They're doing evil things. They're always heroes, freedom fighters, or murderers that need to kill, like one of the famous Nazis who said, it's not nice to kill children. But someone's got to do it. If I don't kill these kids, the vermin is going to continue, and someone else is going to have to do it. So I've got to take responsibility, and it's my job, and kill them. So this is a standard way of doing things. This is how we think. So what's happened there is self-deceit. Right? Something's happening that's blocking people from seeing what is the case. Namely, if these are children, and you don't want to, it's not a good thing to do. And I think so. What we need to do, the hope is, and this is the hope because this still needs to be tested. This is existential conversations are an experiment. But I think we're onto something. No, I wouldn't be doing it. But is we need to show students what are the blocks, what are the things that stop people from being decent. Not telling people what is good. We know that we can calculate that in difficult circumstances we can sort things out. We kind of have the equipment to do that, but we also have equipment to hide reality from ourselves. And we do that in order to protect ourselves in some way or another. So racist white South Africans will say, I'm not racist. And I work hard for my money, and the poor people are lazy. That's why they don't make money. Right? That's why they're living in the shacks. I know black people live in the shacks because they're just lazy. Those are rational. So we need to show people that those sorts of rationalizations are stopping you from seeing the world as it is. And that in fact it's not in your interest to see the world like that. Even though it helps you feel good in your luxury, it's not something that you would want if you were able to reflect on yourself and realize that in fact you're alienating yourself. Someone in one of our conversations called this the Constantia conundrum. That was a lovely phrase to talk about. Constantia is posh, really posh, like a bubble. A bubble, and I think bubble is a nice description because bubble is like this place where the inside, there's this bubble that blocks you from seeing the world as it is. And so how do we stop people from seeing things, from deceiving themselves? And part of the story will obviously be changing the world so that mindsets don't get replicated. But that's too big of a project for someone to do. And I actually think the way the world changes things is not not one hero, it's not a Madiba that's going to save us. It's a bunch of people. In fact, I'm just reading Mandela's biography, and it was towards the very end of his period of incarceration that it was decided that he would be the face of the ANC. Before then, it was lots of people doing lots of things. But of course, it was a good thing that arguably a good thing that he was put there as the face of the ANC, as a kind of benevolent figure that would help stop whatever. We can discuss that. It doesn't matter. But the point is that it was lots of people doing lots of illegal things that changed one big mastermind. So the contribution that we're doing is setting a ball in motion that will hopefully change mindsets, that will hopefully help make an impact in the society, but also at Rhodes. So my concern here then is to make existential conversations, because of its general nature, is to make existential conversations a compulsory course for all first-year students. And the strategy there is to go very slowly. We've done that. We've piloted this for 2 years with volunteers. We've now, at this point, a diploma, a short course, in other words, a diploma learning course. And if I get away with what I want to do, and with the support of people like Chrissy Bowie, we will this will happen next year. It will become a credit learning course. And very slowly we'll move our way, hopefully, thanks by just the success of the course. It will give us leverage to convince recalcitrant forces within the university that change is necessary, and that this is a good idea. So that's the sort of idea we position ourselves in. Whether we manage that or not, I don't know. But even if we don't manage to do that, I think we will still have something to offer the university.
So, Pedro, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Constantia conundrum, just to demonstrate how this course works?
Okay, so the way it works, yes, good. So in terms of practical things, we want to speak the language of the students. This is not a course which is part of a major. So there are lots of things, there are lots of constraints that we don't have that allows us to experiment. And my sense, and I think, is that students are not. We need to engage in a course in a way that has an impact with not just the head but also the body, the whole person. So we try to avoid readings, certainly not technical readings, and we focus on videos that are very immediate and touch us completely, right? So we use a lot of material, we use movies, we use a lot of them, and actually very little reading and writing at all. And the main format is basically sitting in a circle like this and having a conversation. And the mentor is the facilitator. I'm a facilitator at the moment. Just facilitates, doesn't lecture, just facilitates. So we discuss. We have a video, and we discuss the content of the video. The video will show a particular social psychological experiment, or some issue related to gender injustice, or some issue related to race, or how racism gets set up. For example, like Jane Elliott's brown eye and blue eye experiment, famous experiment in the 60s, early 70s, which shows how easy it is for us to become bigoted. And we discuss it, and a lot of very interesting things come out of that. And the idea eventually will be that we, as in academics, will move to the background, and students will take over. So the idea is that you do this program for a year. If you do this for a year, some of the people who do that for a year will be able to become facilitators for the following year. And so the idea is that, and so we will progressively all move back and to the students. So we'll give the material to the students, to the facilitators to kind of share with the people, and we'll obviously keep an eye on things, and there's a lot of other little details that we'll discuss in terms of assessment that we're currently thinking about, which we can discuss in the question time, I guess. But the whole idea is this will be a student-led initiative. We will move back, we will manage it, we'll kind of help ensure that there's institutional memory so this can carry on beyond the particular groups. And so at the moment, because it's the first year diploma in which we have a reasonable number of students, we're already starting to select the facilitators. And then eventually it will happen, once the groups grow, that we will have a steady stock of facilitators. So we carry on in that sort of way.
All right. We're going to give some time for talking about Pedro's introduction, asking questions, or interrogating, troubling.
Student feedback has been unanimously very, very, very high. Not unanimous.
No, I wanted to say that Churchill was involved in going to speak to each of the groups at the end of last term. And something that always kind of makes me feel that something good is happening when a student says, I think differently about the world. I now see the world differently. That to me is what higher education should be about. And there were a lot of those sorts of comments.
And we've been getting that for the last few years.
David, do you have a question? No, you're okay.
I think I've forgotten what it was, but it was something like, it seems a long time ago now. I suppose for me, a kind of quite frankly, I suppose people in the arts tend to use phrases that I quite frankly don't understand, and every time I use them, every time they use them, a little red flag goes up, sort of the bullshit indicator, and I think, but I don't understand this. I wonder if anyone else does. And one of these phrases is something like, not exactly, but the university is a colonial institution preserving the status quo. So I think, colonial? Do I know what that means? Well, I'm not sure. I'll look it up in the dictionary and look it up. Well, okay, colonial power is something that sits remotely and controls you. Okay, so who's controlling us? No one. So are we colonial power? Are we under the control of a colonial power? No. So what are people going on about? Maybe they're just talking bullshit. Another is the preserver of the status quo. Well, I suppose, yes, in a sense it is, but can it be different? I mean, in a sense, the university is a commercial enterprise that people support because they don't want to live in a shack, essentially. If there was no hope of bettering your material conditions, you wouldn't come here. I wouldn't come here. If anyone in the circle is honest, they also wouldn't come here. So I don't really know if such a statement has any depth. It's in a sense stating the obvious. How can the university not be a preserver of the status quo? So how can the university exist simply to enlighten people, but they'll come out as poor as when they entered, or there'll be no job prospects no different job prospects than when they entered? This is just the kind of thing that I question. It doesn't really make sense to me. So, I mean, if I'm honest, that's my concern.
Do I have to answer? Can we just have a
conversation? No, you don't. But I mean, they are
the one I want to answer.
They are your. I mean, it does seem to be something you understand. So, I mean, you must have meant something by that. So, I'm just curious about what you meant. That's yeah.
Do you want me to answer that? I'm a little bit concerned. I don't want to answer that question too deeply because that question is a side issue. It doesn't really touch on the content.
I thought the central issue was sort of changing the role of the university.
But the vision of understanding that you have in mind is, I think, mistaken. So the vision of understanding that I understand you having is basically the view that, and when you talk about control, that you understand you're not biased by your position, right, in the world, for example, as a white male. Now, maybe the best way for me to just invite you to think about it, and I don't want to go into it because it would take us, I think, out of what we really want to focus on, which is the course itself, is imagine if philosophy or physics was philosophy is a little better. Imagine if physics is a little bit more complicated, but imagine if philosophy was if mainstream philosophy during apartheid South Africa was not done in privileged white institutions, but it was done in the shacks. Imagine if it was done in the shacks, in the townships. It was actually, a lot of it was done. Steve Biko is a good example. But imagine if mainstream, right, philosophy in South Africa was performed in a very different space. And my hunch, and I don't really want to get into it too much because again it will take us, we can talk about this over lunch or coffee, whatever, is that it would be incredibly different from what it was and what it is today. And that's something that That's when we talk about structural conditions, and we talk about the formation of minds in particular places. Right? So when we talk about ideology and ideological formations, so the picture of mind that you have is a picture of a kind of cerebral individual who understands and sees the world, and all they have to do is just through their own effort, just go and look at what is the case. Whereas the sort of picture that's informing a lot of what we're doing in existential conversations is much more informed by this idea that, well, if we did, for example, that's highlighted by the example of thinking about how people would think, how mainstream philosophy would character that discipline, as was a function of how people in the discipline thinking would be very different if it was done in a very different space, in a very different social position. And it's interesting, for example, that white philosophers, white male philosophers like myself, tend to be quite impervious to these sorts of issues. So, for example, and feminists, both second and third wave feminists, race theorists, almost all women who've been marginalized and treated like second-rate citizens, or black people, same sort of story, or black women, same sort of story, are the sort of people who talk more clearly, more vehemently about these sorts of things, because there's a kind of blindness in the way that society is and is structured, economic inequalities and whatnot. What people call symbolic orders as well have an impact on the way that we think without us even realizing that we're thinking in these ways. That's deep stuff. There's deep stuff, and that's something that it's got a long and venerable tradition, and it goes back at least as far back as Marx. But just a simple case, I think a simple example is good. Just think about what philosophy would look like were it performed in the shacks. And my hunch it would look much more like Steve Biko than one of my old white male colleagues who works at here or at the University of Irish. It would be very different.
I don't understand that.
Right.
To be honest,
But let's leave it. Let's leave it because it really is a marginal point that is not relevant, I think, for today. But I'm very happy to have this conversation with you.
Okay, but so my question is, so do you think philosophy is something that arises out of context? Or is it something that, but on the other hand, so I'm a mathematician, math is not something that arises out of context. It sort of is a kind of, Leibniz and Newton can both discover calculus independently because they've got to the edge of what is allowed by the math that they know. So in order for them, so that they kind of reach a crisis and then have to develop new machinery. So math is a sort of crisis-induced, it undergoes crisis-induced developments. So that's a bit of what my conversation is about. So if I can get going, we're still with questions.
No, it's okay. So what we have now is Virgin can talk, and then after Virgin's talk, we have a conversation about whether you can speak to that.
And it's quite deliberate that we have such different disciplines just to enable us to kind of think through what it means. And when you're thinking about transformation, what is it? It is so different in different disciplines.
We're going to keep on discussing this one.
Yeah.
Quickly, I'm afraid I see these red flags going up all the time as well. You're going to give a course where they're not going to have to do any reading or any writing. Tell me how, and everybody in the university is going to do it. Tell me how we timetable it. Tell me how we examine it. Tell me if anybody can possibly fail it. And by what criteria are you going to have a distinction?
I can answer those questions, but do I do that now? I'm not sure what to do.
Maybe you should respond to that question.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people would probably have that sort of question. So, and it also has to do with, so what's the knowledge?
Yeah. So the knowledge is knowledge is okay. So the way philosophy started is really asking the questions: who am I, and what is the world, and how, what is the world that I live in? So basically, how do I, and fundamentally, the central part of that is how do I live my life, right? And that's something, that's ethics, right? So we want to teach ethics to our students. One thing. Second thing, this course is not a course that's meant to, it's not a major. It's quite deliberately, we don't want that to be the case, right? But there is an assessment, and the assessment is, and I tell my students quite deliberately, this course is extremely easy to pass because it's not about passing. It's not about, this course is not going to make you, it's going to make you a better accountant, but it's not going to make you a better accountant or a better philosopher or a better, in the standard sense. So I let you do the standard thing, go through the lectures, do the exams, but this course will give you an opportunity to do something. So I see the course as an opportunity, not so much as a rite of passage or as a firewall or something else. And but of course there is something that we think is important, and that's the formative assessment side, because what assessment does, what I think the main thing about assessment certainly in a course like this one, and we can discuss whether this is not also relevant for all courses, that we can have that debate. But in this course, I think what's really important is formative. We need an assessment which will, in a way, invite students to pay attention to what's happening during the existential conversations themselves, to pay attention to what's happening in the movies, because we also show movies once a week, and to start reflecting on the sort of things that we've spoken about during the week. That we will do, and we will do it with a final project. And what we've done in the last semester is a multimedia project. So we've asked students to do a multimedia project. We moved a little bit away from prescribing a multimedia project. What we're going to ask students as of next year is we're going to ask students to come up with their own assessment. So we're going to have one block every week in which students sit down and they have to come up with their own assessment. So and what's important there is because that's going to be allowing students to think about the criteria, which is ultimately what is the point of the course, right? So they're going to start thinking about why am I in this course? Why are we doing the sort of things that we're doing? And what is the best way for me to show to demonstrate my understanding of this sort of course? And we're going to invite students to do anything they want. They can do a dramatic production, they can do artistic work, they can do a poster, they can do essays, they can do a multimedia project. But the whole point is they have to come up with an idea that's going to reflect their understanding of the content of the course. And that is going to be the primary form of assessment, which is going to pass them or fail. And we're hoping, if we can get away with it, that there will only be 3 marks. Pass, fail, pass with distinction. And for international students, we just translate each of those into a different percentage. There's no way a course like this can be assessed in a fine way.
It's more about self.
It's about development of the self, and it's about understanding your own disciplines within a framework of this is why I'm interested in physics. This is why I'm interested in mathematics. I'm a human being. This is an important discipline that has been developed by human beings for these and these reasons. Right? So I see and frame my own concerns within the framework of the human whole. And that's a sort of, it gives you, the sort of ideas that the course will give you an orientation. How to timetable it, we've got a plan. So we have the plan we have so far is about two hourly meeting, I'm working off memory. We have one existential conversation, which is 2 hours. We have the movie, which is 2 hours. So this is a lecture in which all the students get together. We have one session a week in which the students get together into small groups. All the students in the big sections where we show material, the students will be together. In the course where they're dealing with the assessment criteria and the development of their own projects, I'm not exactly sure if that's going to be joint or we're going to be together. I'm not exactly sure. I think we will do it together in a big group. And then the existential conversation itself will be done in groups of 20 people. And in terms of venues, there will be no need for any sort of thing special. It can be done in group. So there'll be lots of corners at Rhodes University where students can get together in groups of 20 and just do the thing. The main thing will be a standard course where we just use the standard venues available at Rhodes.
I think this sounds very unusual for Rhodes, but it actually happens in a few places. In the USA, and even in South Africa. So it sounds very revolutionary for us here, but it's not. I mean, the way Pedro's going to do it is going to be slightly different, of course. But this kind of idea of we need to develop as people, not only the intellect, has been in the States. It's quite
Liberal arts colleges.
I was going to say the same thing. I think we need to find ways of rethinking how we assess. I like the fact that students are taking responsibility for their own assessment. I think we, as lecturers, we're scared of letting them take responsibility. We don't trust that they are say from my experience at UCT, I taught a course in health sciences, which is like also a discipline far removed from arts. And they were doing what they called on-site clinical examination for all the disciplines in clinical sciences, clinical science, languages, and other things. And they assess students by examining patients. So there will be a clinical examination examiner. There will be something else, but it was a 3-hour exam that we used to. They were also assessed on going to the wards to interview patients and so forth. So I think what I'm trying to say, Professor Terry, is that whether we get it from Churchill, we need to find ways of relooking at it. I don't believe that you can assess a year's course in 3 hours and be happy with the student getting a distinction. I'm not happy when the students get a distinction. I don't think that is a true reflection of their athletic cram. They can sport, they can do all sorts of things. And I think this formative assessment is one for continuing how well the students
I get it right. You're hoping that all undergraduates will do it.
They do it at Tristan.
they do it at UCT.
1,500 students, we need 100 facilitators, easy. We facilitate the facilitators. The facilitators meet independently every Monday. We discuss the previous week in great detail with the facilitators and pass on the material. We have all the material that they need. They facilitate, they take the initiative. And that's only for the 1 week session. The rest of it is facilitated by us.
Talk to the economics department about how much trouble they have trying to run toilets for 300 people, and you're talking about doing it for about 2,500.
It's possible.
Come on.
We'll invite you back when you're done.
It's real.
Melissa?
I think this is not necessarily, my experience was not necessarily a transformation, but just to add on to what you said about how students learn, distinctions really aren't an indication of any kind of thing. I had an entire class last year that got all distinctions because they were third years and they're doing a basic stats course, and the way you teach it, obviously all you have to do is cram. And they all came out with distinctions, but somewhere in the semester we decided we need a practical component, which we're building upon, and we're talking about how you would do this. And then they had videos on how to work through the practical component. Eventually, we did a test. And the thing about the practical component is when you do stats on the computer, all the stuff that you usually write down is already done. All you have to do is interpret the result. And the results were appalling. And then I was scared to think that I had this entire class with distinctions. They're about to go and do research next year. And whoever requires this course thinks that their students are going to be ready to perform some kind of statistical analysis. But from what I saw from that practical application, they don't really understand the reasoning behind statistics. They can do the calculation for the mean, but they don't understand that that's the center of your distribution. But they know that, okay, in the calculator, I got to do this to get the answer, and they can do that sort of thing. And it's not enough for me to be able to, what upset me about that situation is, it was so difficult to implement that practical component because it was such a massive class and there wasn't enough computers. But at the end of the day, I've done my students a disservice because there isn't enough computers, and that's not okay. The university needs to do something about that.
Okay, just because of time, I'm going to ask Berusha to do his contribution now. 20 minutes at the most, Berusha, and then we will have another 20 minutes for a general discussion. Yeah.
So,
and there's the board, and I did remember to read.
so it's not after they handed in their matric exam, they were sort of made to do it by the pharmacy curriculum at Rhodes. And I basically have, I think that even though they're not aware of it, students come into my class with two premises. One is I do trust myself to do basic mathematics and quantitative things, or the other kind of student that I get is I don't trust myself to do mathematics or quantitative things. So one of the questions that I asked them quite early is if they've ever had a conversation with a slice of chocolate cake. And the conversations with chocolate cake go something like, you know, I'm terribly, terribly delicious. And you will enjoy me very much. Or you know, I'm fattening, stay away from me. Or I'm not gluten-free and you have allergies. So it's not it has nothing to do with math, but in order to think about your perceptions, you somehow need a model for perceptions. And one model for perceptions which comes out of cognitive behavioral therapy and also out of some stuff that was done by psychologist Viktor Frankl, is that we have events in the world and we have responses, which are things that human beings do. So the event would be, say, seeing a slice of chocolate cake, and the response would be how you would behave towards it. Or the event would be seeing a math problem, and the response would be how you would tackle that particular math problem. So if you're embedded in the world, you kind of draw a causal arrow that says events cause our reactions. And the chocolate cake made me eat it, for example. Or the math problem is the thing that is difficult, which stops me from being able to do it. So in order to start talking about perceptions and the fact that we're in this course to grow and to change our perceptions about how we trust ourselves to do math, I have to convince my students that this isn't necessarily true. And there's an intermediate stage where your mind and your way of filtering the world creates your response. And so, in a way, what it is to ask them to examine the quality of their self-trust or how they're able to deal with quantitative things. And then, after I show them this, the first thing I do is tell them that they're not allowed to use calculators, which starts their perceptions going about, you know, the kind of lecturer that I am, and only a mathematician would ever do this, and all sorts of other horrible things that they put on their course evaluation about their response when I say you're not allowed to use calculators from the start to the end of this course. So, in a way, what I want from my students is that they kind of let go of the things that they think they have to do in order to pass a math exam, and some of their beliefs about their own abilities, which in a way stops them from being able to relate to the course and to the material and to the things that I'm saying. Because if they've already decided that they can't do math or that the problems are too difficult for them, then I have no chance of changing their responses or how they would deal with quantitative material and do it for 3 years in a pharmacy degree, for example. So I bring this model up, and when I think about the curriculum, we don't really, well, what we need is a sort of a model for our perceptions, and also a model for checking our perceptions against reality, or a way of correcting our perceptions. So, from a philosophical perspective, people would call that meta thinking. So, the way that I see university and the way that universities go is it's sort of, we have a context which creates events and expects responses, which are what we see on our exams that get handed in. And these events that we create, like the kind of crises for my first years, you have a test and that is your crisis, and you are the protagonist, and in order to, get beyond your crisis, you have to change your perceptions about first-year calculus. And this generates action and moves things forward, or if the protagonist is already capable of dealing with that test, they don't necessarily have to change their perceptions too much. So, in a way, what I would argue is that the curriculum acts as an environment, and what we do when we think of assessment is a sort of Darwinian goodness of fit, because what we're checking is people's perceptions against our perceptions of what they should be able to do as, say, math students on a certain level, or as physicists. And I know this may not necessarily apply with humanities, but a couple of weeks ago somebody asked me what I thought about assessment and asked me to draw some diagrams. And all that I could come up with was two doors, one that lets you through and one that doesn't let you through. And unfortunately for maths or engineering, this is pretty much it. Either you can do it or you can't, but it may not be testing it might not even be testing your ability, just how much you've memorized, how good you are at algorithms, whether you had enough sleep the night before. So that's what I think about assessment and curriculum. And in a sense, teaching for me is sort of building cracks into people's perceptions, so in this sense, in a way to move them out of frameworks that don't work. Or, for example, a pharmacist who's going to need to know a lot about graphs, carrying a belief like, I don't trust myself with quantitative material, isn't something that's going to serve them, and it's not going to make them into a better pharmacist, for example. So this is what I think of how universities are, and as a kind of closing, what I would say is that in order to change the curriculum, to transform it, which is then what I would like is that we take away ways of being fragile, and so I'll qualify these in a moment. So there's a writer who is a financier / philosopher who made lots of money and then got to tell people what he thought, called Nassim Taleb. And because of his background in finance, he's interested in how systems behave in response to volatile environments. Because in a sense, what we're supposed to be doing, I think, in universities, is preparing people for the world. And the world isn't a sort of static environment, it's a volatile environment. Things change, and the skills that you hopefully learn at university should prepare you for dealing with volatility. And his way of categorizing systems under volatility is that you have fragile systems which, when there are changes in the environment, tend to break. So if the environment would change very little, a fragile thing would break. So you can think of that in the university context as a student who memorizes a proof. So you memorize a proof, and lo and behold, it doesn't come out in the exam, and you're in big trouble. Something that would be robust would, if there's a change in the environment, then it's preserved, but it doesn't necessarily get any better or stronger or more capable. And one of the things that is quite robust and doesn't really enhance your thinking or change it too much is if you learn how to use a calculator at a young age to do arithmetic, for example. You can keep doing arithmetic on it. it's not going to necessarily change thinking in a great way or improve it in a great way. So, and in a sense, by letting yourself be sort of, by having a calculator as a sort of crutch, you tend to get more fragile. So what he would refer to as the anti-fragile is this, well, the example from classics is the hydra, which gets stronger. The more you expose it to changes, the more volatile the environment, the stronger anti-fragile idea or concept or thing gets. So one skill which is particularly anti-fragile for a math class is problem solving. Because when you expose students who are good at problem solving to different kinds of problems to solve, their problem solving gets better. And really, all I think that I'm doing in a first year class or even in a third year class is somehow constructing measures to figure out how well people problem solve. And if I'm doing my job correctly, then their problem solving skills are getting better because of the environment that I'm providing as a lecturer. And I don't know of general ways or if there is sort of grand ideas of how to teach problem solving, but I'm sure that if you put a bunch of lecturers or mathematicians into a room and pick their brains about how they would go about getting their classes to think about problem solving, you would get quite a few good ideas. So that's why I don't think I've been 20 minutes, but those are roughly what I was.
You were also caring about the person, not just about the learning of the maths, because that change of perceptions is much. It's to prepare the person to learn the maths. You didn't know that.
Well, look, I spent a lot of time teaching in all sorts of different places. One of them was in Caterham Township. So after about a month of teaching, you find out that the grade 8 teacher locked up the textbooks in the classroom somewhere and used to take extended staff breaks. The principal starts to fight with you because you're, in a sense, showing the students that this is actually what the teacher should be doing with his time. And it was on behalf of the Cumber. And with that project, you get to see that actually the problems in South Africa with education they're not sort of grand, big problems that we can solve with grand, big ideas. They're practical problems like kids not getting pencils or textbooks that disappear en route to the school because somebody thinks it's funny to take away these free textbooks and then sell them to the kids afterwards. It's, sort of a 15-year-old, a 17-year-old who's top of his class that doesn't know how to fill out a university application, even though he would be guaranteed to get a place at university and a scholarship because he's come from a disadvantaged background, and he doesn't have the know-how to fill out a university application, or he doesn't have 200 Rand to put the application to the central applications office. So those are sort of pragmatic things. And if you come to university, so a place like Rhodes, and teach pharmacists that come from all walks of life, some of them have A-level, some of them have been to top schools, they don't need my course to learn calculus. And then you have others that really need to have their hands held and to be told you don't cancel the logs from either side of this equation because you can't divide by a log, it's a function. And if you spend enough time doing this in the first sort of 4 to 6 weeks of the class, you get the class on your side. And once you've got a class on your side, they're much easier to teach. So in a way, even if with a big class, because I go to the tutorials and they can see that I'm there with them, I do this, this, and this, and this is what we're doing. And all you have to do is follow the algorithm very precisely and start testing it against all of these different cases to learn how it works. And that's pretty much my way of teaching. I mean, I don't know if that. So I don't see sort of grand problems, but very, if you can move, in a sense, if you can move a class from the bottom and, how do I, you only have to change about 10% of the class, which is about 20 students which you would interact with in a normal tutorial. And if I can convince sort of the bottom 10% of the class that they really can do math, and the top 10% that they can work with the students around them, and they don't have to do any teaching. I know, because as a lecturer you're sort of at the tip of an iceberg with some puppet strings, and you're trying to maneuver things around in a curriculum, and you tend to be far removed. And I try to make that gap between being the lecturer and having as small as possible. And that took lots of work. So I don't know, that's my way of
Can I try something up? So, if it's true that you are concerned about people, right? Then maybe there's something to be said about not necessarily what you do, but how we would work together, right? So, in a larger institutional frame. So let me use an example that I've used in a paper of mine. So there's this doctor called the Angel of Death, Mengele, right? He did experiments on Jews, primarily Jews, on concentration camps. He was a crank. He wanted to discover the secret of how to produce more twins so that the Aryan race could multiply more quickly. But suppose, let's make a few tweaks. He wasn't a crank. Let's suppose that he was in some level a competent doctor, or a mathematician in a slightly different context, but working for the same regime. So Mengele was convinced about the rightness of the Nazi ideology. Right? Just imagine him a little bit different. Imagine that he was a person that actually made some really important discoveries with his torture of prisoners. And he did discover that there's a secret to how to produce twins, blah, blah, blah. And he wasn't kind of informed by some dodgy scientific theories, but he managed to do something really a breakthrough in some sense that could help other people outside of the framework of the Nazi world. I still think there's something weird about the nature of his medical knowledge, because his medical knowledge is part of an overall. Because knowledge can't be separated into bits, I guess, in some ways, right? It's not just that I have the bit of my brain that's the mathematical bit and the bit that's something else, but rather these kind of inform each other. They help create a picture of the world. So I'm wondering to what extent it doesn't actually matter. It does actually matter, right? And the sort of concerns that I was expressing are also concerns that you could have, although you might not have to teach them in your specific courses, but they're concerns that are relevant to the knowledge project of maths.
Okay, so I'm not sure what question you're asking me.
So I put a case. So Mengele is this idiot who has weird views about the world, almost everything, but he's a really good doctor at some level.
Yeah.
I want to say that at some other level he's not a good doctor, because he's using his medicine. I mean, the goals that inform his life in the world are just completely messed up, which explains why he was able to torture and murder people in the way that he did. Now in maths, you can imagine similar things, right? Rocket technology and whatnot. You can imagine mathematicians people, or decoding codes to find information that shouldn't quite legitimately hidden from you,
Okay.
suppose, or whatever. You know,
Okay.
you can imagine some. Or
Yeah.
spy. You know, I know a mathematician in Australia became a spy for ASIO.
Yeah.
I imagine him doing all sorts of dodgy things. With maybe a very good mathematician at some level, but at another level, I'm suggesting you might want to say he's a mediocre mathematician.
Well, look, in a sense, people doing mathematics and people, what they do in their personal lives and their personal code of ethics are different things. I mean, whether Newton or Leibniz was a better mathematician is completely irrelevant to me in learning calculus. I mean, Newton spent the better part of his life trying to discredit Leibniz, who came up with an equally valid version of calculus. So I have to make my own moral judgments and moral decisions using my own sense of morality in my own life, but I don't necessarily need to sort of examine Newton's ethics in order to map or to understand that.
Can I just clarify the point?
Yeah.
The point I'm making is epistemic, not just ethical.
Okay.
Right? So it's a point about the nature of my knowledge, not just about the goodness of myself as a person. So, and I'm wondering, so it's also ethical in the sense that I'm wondering to what extent the ethical. So my point is, we're here at university, right? So let's look broad. We're here at university. You're one call, I'm another call. We're in this thing together. What is it that we want at the end, right? What sort of, and I think if you have let me just use the word, without defining it, holistic understanding of what it is, of the knowledge project, then in which there's relationships of mutual constitution. There's something about math that's about seeing the world as it is, right? Seeing something, right? A dimension of the world, right? And so if we're concerned about this idea of encouraging, and I think one way of understanding the university art is kind of opening our sight towards the world in an ideal sense, then we should be working together, and we should, in my view at least, we should understand your specific domain, my specific domain, as part of a larger domain of understanding. But overall, also because your mathematical understanding cannot be separated. This is the hypothesis from who you are and what you do. That's the hypothesis of the postmodern. So you're focusing on one view, and I'm saying, well, think about this other one.
Okay, but you have different. So you can have two artists who are both good at art, but have different ethics. So they could be at the same level in terms of art, but at different levels in terms of ethics. And that's not disconnecting what they know from what they do. In a sense, math is an aesthetic subject, so it's a kind of art form. And the way that mathematicians will tell you this is an art form is because it has certain internal integrity. Okay, math can't be inconsistent. If you have inconsistencies in math, you chuck them out. So in a sense, I could say Newton was very integritous in his mathematical life, but not integritous in his personal life. Because in his mathematical life, he was motivated by needing a sense of honesty and consistency in his math. But in his personal life, in order to achieve more esteem for himself, he was more than willing to put Leibniz down. There's a story of Euler and I think Diderot having an argument in the Russian court, and Diderot came with all of his arguments to say, well, this is why atheism is true. And Euler wrote an equation down on the board and said, well, this is why God exists. And what Euler did, which was a very sneaky thing to do, was to completely destroy the other guy's framework for his argument. He didn't engage with an argument with him. He just sort of said, well, I have authority because of my mathematical background and my understanding of equations, and therefore I win this argument. So it's not, math is, in a sense, as open to manipulation as anything, but so all I would say to that is that ethics is really invested into an individual, not into a kind of. I mean, that's
I can contest it, but
yeah.
let's have a conversation.
Sorry. So you want to say something? Okay. I'm just thinking about what you did there with the fragile memorizing proofs, calculator problem solving. You kind of you tipped our learning upside down, which is something I've been thinking about.
Other brain, is that what you said?
Tipped it upside down. So typically we learn how to calculate things. I mean, we know the formulas that we learn how to calculate. Then you give us a problem and we apply the formula. But I've been thinking about doing it the other way around. So, because I was thinking about how students can contribute to our learning, where you say, I think there's a way, even in stats, right? And in stats, I think this is actually something you could do. You could start a class by saying, okay, what's a common thing we're talking about in the news? Let's talk about, I don't know, VW and the car emissions issues. What are the variables that contributed to that? How do you think those variables are distributed? How do you think how they correlated? How do we model that into the crisis that we have? I'm just asking things that you're already thinking about, which shows you that you already have some kind of statistical reasoning.
Yeah.
And then we can go to how do you calculate, how do we formulate the things about that? And this could even speak to control. You were asking about control. I mean, I've been taught the other way.
Yeah.
Where I couldn't, until now, I haven't been able to reason the other way around, but that's what I'm expected to do when I go and sit in a job interview. They don't ask you how to calculate something, they ask you a problem, and you're supposed to apply it. So it's about, and that sort of thing could bring out then what the type of human being you're trying to develop as well. Those kinds of conversations, those kinds of discourses in your classroom could open up whatever conversations that develop some kind of moral activity. And unfortunately, it's something that's obviously very difficult to build up to. I don't know how it would work. It's just an ideal that I like.
Well,
I think would be interesting.
Look, you can go and ask the first year class, give me an example of a variable. What is a quantitative variable? And almost always they'll come up with either things like acceleration or displacement or things that they've read out of their textbooks. And then the way that it's to keep sort of probing and saying, well, give me an example that you haven't found, that you haven't read somewhere. And eventually somebody would spit out, my bank account and we do have a common context. I mean, the first years that I teach have Facebook friends. And the number of Facebook friends that you have is a quantitative variable that Facebook does calculus on when it decides what to advertise to you. So those are things that, because what I would want somebody to do in my class is to build a relationship to the field that I'm trying to teach them, and it's not. I mean, what I know from university is that we learn a lot about how things that in real life happen to be, in a sense, oracles, or what computer scientists will call black boxes, how they behave. So the economy is a black box for us, and we don't really know how it behaves, but we have some theories about how it behaves, which people have formulated over a long time. So what is more important, knowing the theory of how the economy behaves, or having the skills to formulate premises about how it will behave or how it might behave in the future, or how to deal with the crisis in the economy. Because in 2008, we thought that the banking system was all safe, and what happened was economic thinking reached a sort of, had to confront the reality of, well, there's a liquidity problem because we sold debt further and further up until it sort of coalesced onto one bank, and then that bank collapsed, and then that caused everything else around it to collapse. But it wasn't something they could predict, because their model for economics as a reality was was sort of inaccurate compared to the actual reality of the world. So how do we teach people to formulate models? I mean, that's what I do as want people to be able to do, having left my course, which is mainly about modeling. So you have to approach it from the wrong way around, or start with the problem and say, well, how do you abstract this? How do you generalize it? Here are two cases. What is different between this case and that case? And I think a lot of the time, because people expect it of us, we do the work for the students and say that they can't do the work or they can't make that gap. But we're evidence that it's possible to jump that gap and to solve problems and to do things with you have people. So yeah, my scientific hero is Richard Feynman, who's the consummate problem solver. I mean, there are other examples as well, like people like Erdos and so.
David, what was this?
I just wanted to raise a concern. I understood that the existential conversations course will be compulsory. Is that right?
No, we're not there yet.
Okay.
It's the aim.
Because I feel quite uncomfortable about making courses compulsory. I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that so if I look at our department and what we teach students and what we can teach students, students are capable of responding to at undergraduate level, is that we are actually behind. We're below UCT. UCT is probably below international levels. So we below international standards. Our students are already stressed. They're extremely stressed. So giving students physics, mathematics, computer science, and some other science student. Let's say a student is focused. They know what they want to do. Those people are stressed. And to on top of that have to do another course. What do we do? Do we stress them more, or do we say, okay, don't do mathematics, just do the existential conversations? You do physics and existential conversations. We'll change the curriculum. I that sort of problem with it. We are already, if we are realistic at what we teach at first year level, because we have a tutorial system that UCT doesn't, we have fewer lectures in the year, which means we leave out more sections of our 1,200 page first year textbook, which means that students get to third year level without having done certain topics, which they can catch up on later on. But in a sense, it's a slightly uncomfortable situation. That's a concern of mine.
Should I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay, I don't want to hold. So, yeah. Well, there's a few. I mean, I'm probably not going to convince you by saying that I don't see why we should be subject to. There's a kind of enslavement to a particular sort of program, which I'm not sure why we need. It's not obvious to me that that's what we need. I made a few comments about why I'm concerned with the international philosophical community. I'm actually quite concerned that sometimes we try to cram in too many things in my own field, and it would be, so I'm speaking from my field, I can't. So I'm not sure why we need to get our priorities right. We need to think about what the point of a university is. What are we educating for? This is a sort of bigger question about why I was trying to working together to understand what it is that we want to. And I was suggesting what a picture we would want, and there's certainly a lot of pressure around lots of different places that we're not kind of bringing up the sort of students that we want to drive society in the future, right? So if we get that right, and rather than thinking about our disciplines in isolation, then I think maybe you will find the idea more appealing. Another thing is, of course, that there's a possibility of extending, and that's also been talked about quite widely, right? Extending this to a fourth-year term. Another concern and that would solve a lot of problems perhaps that exist with extended studies as a kind of way of othering a group of students, which is also present at UCT and other places, extended studies programs. And it might be the case that something like existential conversations could actually help. One of the things that I learned also from our experience doing existential conversation in township schools is particularly in Sika, with level kids, is that there's something about, and I know that also from mentoring young people from before coming to university and after coming to university, and how there's a kind of attitudinal issue that's central to the attitudes, changing the attitude towards study in which, and I think existential conversations have the potential of being one node to help address that social problem. So I'm not convinced that we need to be, let me just say, slaves of our established programs. Maybe we do in some fields, maybe not in others. And in that case, we need to think carefully about we need to think carefully about how we structure. I mean, again, I started by saying the university is a new thing. It was a completely different setup across history, the history of understanding. And if you probably go to different, if you trace the history of intellectual development on this continent, you'll find a very different story, say, from the story that happened in the Arab world or the European world. And why assume that what we have now is what it is? I'm not advocating, by the way, I'm not a fan of throwing away everything because it takes a long time to build an institution. But I think I'm inviting, what I'm hoping existential conversations, in particular of what we help, is to invite a kind of creative reconfiguration of what is here, so that we can
I think the fact that so many students, or a number of students in all our institutions, are expressing all sorts of issues and concerns, points that we need to be looking at what we're doing and thinking about. I mean, that's why we have these conversations, not because we think we've got the answers, but because we are concerned that actually maybe we're not achieving what we really want to. In fact, we know we're not. Our failure rates are terrible. In this country. So, it's just time, I think, for us to really think carefully about what we're doing, and whether we are really educating our students, or if we are just forcing 3 years worth of physics down there.
The thing with most mature sciences like physics and geology and chemistry is that what you teach at undergraduate level is a kind of a canon. There's very little variation. There's very little you can leave out. There's very little you can change it. You have to teach it. If you don't teach it, there are dire consequences. So we have to get to that. There are just compulsory topics that you have to teach.
On the canon, I think it's true that in each discipline in higher education there is a canon. But I think at this point in time in our history, we need to think of what informs that canon in the different disciplines, including linguistics, where I am, or sociolinguistics. I was going to, let me give my input the way I put out initially. We are 2015, in 1994, higher education desegregated in South Africa. Initially, it was established for certain races, certain language, and all that. Desegregation happened. Different languages, different races, and so forth, different cultures. And yet, when that change happened, we are still teaching as if it was in 1994. We are teaching as if the people in the classes are homogeneous in terms of the knowledge they bring in class, in terms of their capabilities. We are not looking at the kind of student that he talks about. I think we have to start thinking about the kind of students in our class, because the way we teach, the way I teach is what I teach as if it's a 1994 class, and yet it's totally different. Again, what I wanted to say is that we see in as much as it's not the same at Rhodes.
Could I ask you to give an example?
Example of what?
I just So when you say I'm teaching it as if it's a 1994 class, I don't know what that means. What's a 1994 class?
1994, that
Yeah.
was before Rhodes. I mean, it was highly homogeneous, lots of white students, English speaking.
Generally from good
Generally
educational
from,
contexts,
private schools here.
mostly middle class.
Yeah, and yet now there's extended studies with kids going from the townships to schools. Kids who can't fill in an application form, but are allowed to come to university, and the university is required to support them because they show potential to succeed in university. So we are not tapping into that potential. We're not tapping on the knowledge that they bring into class. We are not saying, we are not looking at the other camp with the other knowledge that has not been presented as camp. Like for instance, in my discipline, you teach Nguki and all the African English or text written in English by African language speakers. There are other texts in Isixhosa that don't form that canon, but the system, the education system has been structured in such a way that it excludes some knowledge and prioritizes others. It's a reality that I don't think I think it's uncomfortable to talk about it in class, in these spaces, and because there are assumptions that higher education is to be this way and this way only. I also wanted to say the city is a microcosm of Rhodes. It's the same.
Okay, so just one more comment. We've passed on for 6, but we'd like to hear from you.
Sorry, I just, as a student, personally, I also find problems with the way in which we're taught and the products as students going into the workforce and whatnot. It's more of education as a commodity and us going into the market system, and not education. Education basically is an end and not a continuous process, even beyond university. And I find that the knowledge we receive here is not one which is context specific and seeks to solve the problems in our most intimate spaces, so in South Africa. And I think it is when you see student mobilization in different campuses and universities, and the dissatisfaction with the education, especially in the university spaces, that is indicative of a lack of transformation. And also, I don't know, I think it's just a lot of things. Yeah, just thinking about this just makes me.
But at least we're talking about it. Yeah, something.
Okay, sure. I think, sure, that this was a particularly difficult conversation to have, I think, for many of us here. But I think, Pedro, what you, and also Virushan, what emerged for me was a need, from what Pedro was saying, of teaching more than the canon, more than what we've come to recognize as legitimate knowledge, but also to teach a way of being in the world with that knowledge. And so using our knowledge and our learning, whether it be philosophy, sociolinguistics, physics, mathematics, to see the world as it really is, so that as an economist, for example, we don't build false models of how the world is that results in, the economy that crashed dramatically in the way it did and left millions of people destitute. And I think that's sort of what you're trying to say is that it's about framing, framing the knowledge, and helping our students to become particular kinds of people, to be able to view the world through very critical lenses, so that they can use their knowledge in particular ways. That's what I understood.